Welcome back to 101 East. Memories of the 1997 Asian financial crisis are still fresh in the minds of Indonesians. The country's barely recovered from the onerous conditions that were imposed by the IMF then. And this time around, Jakarta has rejected offers of more international help. Fawzia Ibrahim reports on how Indonesia is planning to go it alone.
Modern Jakarta is a testament as to how far Indonesia has come in 10 years. Since the 1997 Asian economic crisis, this nation has reformed its financial institutions and cleaned up its governance. The nation's economy is now a balance of international trade and traditional livelihoods, giving it the confidence to ride out a global recession.
All the fundamentals, economic and political, is in the better condition to face the crisis. Having said that, of course, that we realize the impact of crisis already hit our economy.
Among the first to be affected were Indonesia's palm oil, timber and coal exports, falling victim to a global decline in demand for commodities. This led to the country's main index falling by over 20% in October. The government closed the stock exchange for 3 days to shore up the market. The rupiah has fallen almost 25% this year. After several years of growth, it appears Indonesia's economy is starting to unravel. Much of that is due to the export sector, which makes up 30% of the nation's economy, but is also the biggest employer.
A large part of Indonesia's exports is made up of the manufacturing sector, producing electronics, furniture, shoes and garments. But with international orders shrinking, the textile industry is already starting to feel the pinch. At stake is 2.5 million jobs in West Java alone.
In the last few months, exports have fallen by 12% and more than 60,000 factory workers have been laid off. Employers are urging immediate action before the situation worsens.
That's why we ask the government to put stimulus. When we lay them out from the manufacturing, then the government have to give them jobs from the infrastructures and the stimulus and the investment that the government need to do.
An economic crisis is a test for any leadership, but with an election due next year, President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono will have his work cut out for him.
SBY, is trying very hard now, but situation is just against him. He's trying to show what he has done, this and that, but people, because of this crisis, start not to believe what he tell us now, When we have the crisis in 97, 98, there's also a political crisis at the time. Whether we will repeat it again next year, I hope not.
In the end, Indonesians may have to rely on their resilience to survive the current financial crisis. Like 47-year-old Sarimo, who was laid off from his job at a metals factory 10 years ago. Since then, he's been selling food on Jakarta's streets.
I earn enough to support my family. In fact, I now earn more than when I was working in the company. Hawker sellers like us are never affected by an economic crisis. People will always want simple and cheap food like this when everything else becomes expensive. That's why the hawker business never goes under.
At a time when Asia is grappling with a global economic downturn, many Indonesians are looking for homegrown solutions to help them through the crisis.
With me in the studio are Cyrus Darawala, Managing Director of Financial Insights for the Asia Pacific, Professor Walden Bello, Director of the Advocacy Institute Focus on the Global South, and Dr. Steve Keen, Associate Professor of Economics and Finance at the University of Western Sydney. Steve, in Latin America, in Russia, in Africa, in Asia, the IMF prescriptions for countries have been roundly criticized for a very long time. Given the fact that we've just seen the entire Western financial institution collapse in on itself, is it right for Indonesia, for Malaysia, for a lot of countries to turn around and say, you don't know what is right for our country?
Absolutely. The one country that got through the Asian crisis particularly effectively was Malaysia, where Mahathir basically told the IMF to go jump. And at the time I had conventional economic journalists telling me that, well, this will be a great test between the IMF prescription and going against it, and it was, and Malaysia came out on top.
What are the options, though, if we don't have help from the great global bodies that were set up initially as an attempt to stop this sort of thing from happening?
Well, I think we should just accept the fact that the bank, the World Bank, the IMF, have really become irrelevant institutions given the
But who is there
past.
to take their place?
Well, what we really should be talking about now is more regional approaches to the situation. The Chiang Mai initiative, the ASEAN Plus 3, is one important step. But at the same time, I think we really need a reorientation of the economic paradigm away from this kind of globalized paradigm in which we rely on foreign markets to rethinking and refocusing back on domestic and regional markets. That's really where
it goes beyond that too, because it's not just going from global to regional, it's also abandoning a whole way of thinking about the economy, which is now classically proving itself wrong. My favourite was the OECD in June of 2007 wrote that economic conditions are very benign. Our forecast is the best in years, etc. 2 months later, the crisis began. They couldn't have got it more wrong.
But what these gentlemen are talking about is a complete 180 from what has been economic orthodoxy for a long time.
And
now.
they are not wrong at all. I think what they're also saying is the dependency on any one large country, albeit the US, or a cluster of nations such as Europe, to be 60% of your exports is wrong, fundamentally wrong. So insular markets, as Steve mentioned, Malaysia came out, Indonesia came out, Thailand is still fairly insular. India, very large nation, has been affected, but not to that level. China, yes, they've lost the jobs, but if you go back and see where the jobs were lost, they were on the complete and absolute no value add factory bits. So
if we were having this conversation in the US right now, you would have almost the entire mainstream economic establishment getting very angry right now. They'd be saying the globalization argument is still very strong.
Well, who's to blame for that?
They have sold a bad analysis, and we've swallowed it for too long, and they've ignored the importance of the financial side of the economy. It might horrify most people who aren't economists to learn that economists don't regard money as important. They leave money and debt out of their theories. That's why they didn't see this thing coming. And you have people like Joseph Stiglitz who are basically saying, I don't know why this is occurring. And he's one of the good ones.
Yes, I mean, I fully agree with Steve here. I think we are seeing the end of an economic paradigm, that really set us off in the wrong direction. I think that economists, just like the big financiers, should take the hit for this.
But still, surely we're not saying we need to go back to days of closed borders, trade sanctions, taxes on everything that moves.
It's not closed borders, it's closed thinking. We have lived a mythical view of how the economy functions, and now we're seeing what happens when you put a myth into reality and then let the real world system run. It's a myth of Milton Friedman we need to abandon. Keynes was not an anti-internationalist by any stretch of imagination, but his analysis and his approach was diametrically opposed to the Friedmanites who took over in the 1970s, and it's that way of thought we have to abandon.
Cyrus, you're the positive one here. You're expecting an upturn by the end of next year. Correct. If we get rid of globalization as an economic framework, we're not going to see an upturn.
No, we're not saying get rid of globalization. We are saying be self-sustained first and then go out. Your dependency, exactly, your dependency on any one country to be 80% of your exports is just fundamentally bad economics and bad business.
But how quickly can a country turn around that model that's already in place?
Well, I mean, most of the ASEAN plus 3, again, as he mentioned, are pretty self-sustained. They have large populations. Industry growth and farm growth is basically self-sustained within the economies. Now, when you start moving again outwards, that's when the issue comes in.
Yes, I think what we really need to do is, following this analysis, is that we really need to make the domestic economy, the domestic market, again, the fulcrum of the economy. The problem really has been that we were sold this kind of model by the World Bank and all of this, which basically said, forget your domestic markets, you've got limited markets, go overseas. And what we really need to do is go back to this process whereby we look at, the local, is what sustains us. And
ask
that when you talk about exports,
who was
that
pressurizing people to open up?
If I can try to encapsulate part of what you're saying, it's back to manufacturing. It's back to local production and away from what was called financial engineering, which is an insult to engineers.
Very quickly, Walden mentioned depression earlier on. Many people won't really know what that means exactly. How can you describe it?
It's a situation of total collapse in financial flows, so that, for example, in America, in the middle of 1929, the unemployment rate was 0. Recorded unemployment was literally 0. It rose to 25% in 3 years.
That sounds worse than the 97 crisis.
It is.
Oh, it is.
It is.
So we're going to see worse than 97.
It is. You will
Yes.
still see a slump. Again, the world has changed since the 30s, where fundamentally the power was in the West. Financial powers were in the West, and they started exuding their powers and making the Asian economies, the Latin American economies open up. Latin America is still growing.
Yes.
Russia is growing.
Well, the thing is that, unfortunately, the way things move is that you need a crisis to really
clean
move
up.
from one paradigm to another, to move from one kind of economy to another. And I think there's no avoiding the fact that we're for a very serious crisis for some time.
Seeds
that
of
will
hope,
last for some
but
time.
worse to come. Gentlemen, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you all very much indeed. That's all we have
Thank
time
you
for.
too.
Welcome.
My thanks to my guests, Cyrus Dariwala, Professor Walden Bello, and Dr. Steve Keen. And that's it from 101 East from all of us. Until next time, bye-bye.